in Recovery 2.0, it really isn't so much about, am I an alcoholic or not? The better question is, am I living the life I want to live? These are the questions that are more relevant than, I wonder if I fit the criteria for chronic alcoholism or not. People look at that, I'm not a chronic alcoholic, and they're like, thank God I don't have to stop drinking. You have been given permission by an 85-year-old document and statement to continue living in a self-destructive way.
I was one of those people. I never met the criteria of a chronic alcoholic that had difficulty doing my job. I was using alcohol as a coping skill, and this was not serving me. And so something like Recovery 2.0 that has a very broad and loving acceptance of wherever you come in without having to label yourself in certain stigmatizing ways. You just want to live a healthier, more connected life. You provide education for people. There's also different tools. There's community, there's a structure and a program, and really freedom for people to explore that wheel of healing. It's figuring out where are you disconnected and help us show you how you can cultivate that sort of healing in yourself on your path.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to In the Circle. I am here with Dr. Tracy Jackson today, and this is going to be a episode of our podcast that departs from our normal procedure. I've decided to interview Tracy because she provides a very powerful perspective, that is to say, the medical scientific perspective of somebody who both has been trained to look at things in a scientific and provable manner, who also has a deep experience as a person on a path of recovery, and also has a depth of experience in the fields of pain management and addiction, and is somebody that I consider to be an expert in transformation. That is to say, helping a human being to transform themselves into greater health, greater well-being. And normally, as you know, if you listen to In the Circle, we normally do sort of a Q&A where somebody asks me a question. Today, I'm going to be asking Tracy quite a few questions, and she certainly is welcome to ask me any question that she desires, but I wanted to provide her perspective to this audience because I feel that it's one of the most important and relevant for our time right now, as we're all looking at the way that we can move forward into greater levels of health and well-being, particularly not just at the level of mind, but also body and spirit. So that holistic approach to health and healing. So Dr. Tracy Jackson, Tracy, as I will call you, thank you and welcome to In the Circle today.
Thanks. Glad to be here.
So Tracy, you wrote me a very powerful letter back in September about your experience as a doctor and a professor at Vanderbilt University. At the time, I had interviewed you for the Recovery 2.0 online conference, maybe going on sort of 6 or 7 years ago, I think. And I had interviewed you at that time. You were at Vanderbilt because you were somebody who thinks outside of the box. And you shared a lot of perspectives. We shared a lot of perspectives with each other when it comes to addiction and health and some of the challenges with the system and the way that we are approaching addiction and mental health in our society. And I loved that interview with you. And I was so surprised, happily, to see you at a Recovery 2.0 workshop, an immersion at Kripalu Center for Yoga and Health in September. And there you were as a participant. I was not interviewing you as an expert, but you were coming and being a part of the circle, as it were, of people who, like me, are on a path of discovery in recovery. So I was incredibly moved to see you there. And then we got into a bunch of conversations, and then you wrote this particular letter to me. I wanted to begin by reading the opening statement of that letter, if you don't mind, and then we can get into a conversation. Okay. So here we go. I graduated valedictorian of my high school class, summa cum laude from university, and number one in my class in medical school. I was chief resident of anesthesiology at the University of North Carolina. I'm fellowship trained at Stanford and triple boarded in anesthesiology, pain, and addiction medicine. I was an associate professor at Vanderbilt University until August of 2018 and created and directed Vanderbilt's Pain Fellowship Training Program. I have published several peer-reviewed scientific articles, and I've been invited to speak at prestigious universities and conferences both here and abroad. I served on the board of directors of the Tennessee Pain Society and helped to author the opioid prescribing guidelines for the state of Tennessee. I really don't think you could have done it academically much better than I. Yet, you wrote, despite my expertise, my patients weren't getting better. I blamed some of it on insurance companies who wouldn't reimburse the next greatest procedure I wanted to do. I blamed it on side effects of the available pills. I chalked some of it up to patients not being compliant with what I recommended. I prescribed opioids as I was taught to do, both because I believed they helped and because I couldn't think of anything better that was affordable, accessible, and effective. I did procedures, so many procedures. I gave my standard spiel to my patients the best way I knew how, with the best information I could find, working the most efficiently and effectively I could within what I accepted was a flawed system. The Hippocratic Oath is, first, do no harm. I believe I have violated that oath just by participating in our healthcare system, and my ongoing silence makes me complicit in our shared suffering. I am choosing to speak now, and this is what I have learned. So needless to say, Tracy, that introduction gripped me and spoke to me and provoked me. And here we are today. I'd like to open it up, and I'd like to ask you just a few questions about what your findings have been. So you speak to the system as flawed. I certainly, and I think most of us, see a lot of the glaring challenges that we face in public health as a society, particularly now with regards to mental health and addiction. I was wondering if you could first speak to the problem as the system sees it and how the system treats disease, and what you've come to learn about how disease really needs to be treated if we have any hope of people getting better.
Yeah, thank you for that, for reading that introduction. I think it's been very difficult for me to be in a system. It was always very difficult for me to be in a system that focused primarily on the body, on the structural abnormalities in the body, on an MRI finding, a disc bulge, a broken bone, something along these lines, and then to have such a limited armamentarium of available tools to treat that. The system is really set up to cut and to cure. We are incredible in the American healthcare system if you are in a car accident, if you need a surgery. We are incredibly poorly equipped to treat chronic illnesses. And in fact, if you look at the data on our healthcare outcomes for things that involve mental health, addiction, pain, diabetes, heart disease, these chronic illnesses, our outcomes are some of the worst in the developed world because we focus so much on numbers and imaging findings and these structural abnormalities. And the way that we treat it are with pills and procedures. And it's frustrating for patients in that system and for providers in that system. I think that that is misunderstood, in the sense that we think that the providers in the system really believe in what they are doing. And the bottom line is that there are just no other options that have been made available to providers to do, because we're limited by what insurance will cover, how we are set up to practice. And those things just provide band-aids at best. And it's not to say that some people don't get better in the system. I'm not saying that at all. But by and large, what we find is that the system is set up really poorly to deal with these chronic illnesses. And the reason is because many of these things have to do with what is going on, not in the body, but in the brain. And even that statement in and of itself is inaccurate, because it implies that you can separate the two. I remember very clearly when I was practicing anesthesia and pain, I went over to China with a mentor of mine. And there are two distinct hospital systems. And my understanding at the time was that both of these types of hospital systems, the Western hospitals and the traditional Chinese medicine hospitals, were both equally accessible to the citizens. And they could choose where they would go, to which system to treat what illness. And if they needed a transplant or if they needed a surgery or something along those lines, they went to the Western hospitals. But to treat anything like chronic pain, that was under the purview of traditional Chinese medicine, which just takes into account you cannot separate body, mind, and spirit. That's a ridiculous thing to try to do. And many healing systems have long, especially ancient healing systems, have long recognized that. And so I went on a path of really exploring what I had not been taught. I was trained very well. I was trained as well as you can be trained. And yet I didn't learn anything about some of the things that my patients were doing: acupuncture, yoga, nutrition, none of those things I had ever been exposed to in formal medical training. I mean, think about that for a second. None of those things were ever taught to me in terms of being really relevant. And that's insane, really, if you think about it. And so I had to go after I had already been trained and learn these things, become a yoga instructor, become a Reiki practitioner, learn about nutrition, just to try to educate myself and see why this is, educate myself about neuroscience, educate myself about the reasons some of these things might actually work for people. And that just really started a journey where I moved farther and farther away from doing pills and procedures and trying to incorporate these other sorts of things, not just for my patients, but also for myself. By that point, I was experiencing significant burnout. It's very frustrating to be working in a system where people are not getting better and you're working to the bone to try to create income for the hospital, do the best you can with research, and yet not be able to really break through. And so it was all happening sort of at the same time. I think one of the things that I really learned and appreciated early on in that process was that you have to be pragmatic about things. And this is why I was so drawn to your program, so drawn to something like the 12 steps when you are talking about addiction or recovery, is you can't just yank away the only thing that people have access to, which is pills and procedures, and tell them good luck. You have to be able to give them practical tools for things that they can do that are free and accessible and make sense to them, where they can see meaningful, immediate relief that then they can build on. And so this is why the cornerstone of so much of what I do now initially centers around education as a tool of empowerment. This is going on. This is what is going on. This is why these pills and procedures, although they may help temporarily, have limited utility in the long term. And this is what you can do. This is why this is happening in your body. And this is how you change it. And it's not fast. We Americans want a quick fix. It's not fast. But if you stick with it over time, if you think in terms of years and not in terms of days and months, you will get better. And that's what your program offers. And that's what I've really seen in my practice since I've left traditional medicine.
Well, thank you for that, Tracy. I wonder if you could expound a bit on how do you see the nervous system, the brain, involved in chronic disease, and how is that different from the system and how it sees things? Obviously, if the system is treating with pills and procedures, there's going to be a reductive or it's not treating the whole issue as you've alluded to. What is it treating? What is it hoping to do? Because I believe that people are trying to help people generally,
Yeah.
even though many times their information or the underlying philosophy may not be fully correct in how they're approaching, or there's a limit, or there's some form of constraint. So what made you sort of leave, if you will, the traditional sort of systemic way of approaching this, and how do you see it now from a brain nervous system perspective?
The way I look at it is the sensations of, the first thing that actually ever happened is I started to really think about the difference between pain and suffering. And really, pain is a sensation, and suffering is what happens when you attach stories and emotions to those sensations. And so what the US healthcare system does is really focus on the sensations and reducing the sensations, but doesn't deal with all the other things that can contribute to suffering. And although this is certainly a very oversimplified form of neuroscience with regard to this, I mean, there's no way to sort of explain this in a way to really do it accurate scientific justice. But big picture, the way I think about it is that the sensory input coming up to your brain is just one part of your body's essentially survival system, right? Your warning system of survival. So there are lots of things. We're just animals, right? Our primitive brain is meant to just keep us alive. And so one signal that something could be a danger to our survival is physical sensations coming from our body. 90% of our healthcare system deals with those signals. But there's also emotional signaling, fear, anger, anxiety. There's also past memories. There's what we take in from our five senses. What's going on in our environment? What are our relationships like? It's what we put in our mouth, the food, what kind of toxins essentially are we putting in our mouth? All of these things subconsciously are part of an algorithm, so to speak, that helps the body determine, are we safe in this moment? Yes or no? And the physical sensations coming from the body are just one part of that algorithm. And if we don't take into account that all these other things matter, not in a separate way, not just the body, and not just quote the mind, which incorporates the emotions and the senses and the memories, but also the stories that we tell ourselves about our pain, these patterns that we get into about our suffering. All of this stuff has the ability to act essentially like a thermostat in the center of the brain that can either take a physical sensation from the body and dial it up to a 10, or take a physical sensation from the body and dial it down to a 0. And when you realize this and you explain it to patients, the brain is like a muscle. I mean, consider the brain like a muscle. And you can tell from this accent. I grew up in a small town, and I think of the image of a car driving down a grassy field and making a driveway over time. And if you drive that truck down the grassy field the same way for 20 years, you are going to have some rutted out pathways that go to particular places and experiences in your brain. What fires together wires together, right? Pavlov and the dog, you ring a bell at the same time you give the dog a treat for 30 days in a row. And eventually all you have to do is ring a bell and the dog is going to secrete gastric enzymes There will be physiological changes in response to an environmental stimulus. So you have these same well worn pathways, driveways in the brain. Pills and procedures can put a gate up over that well worn pathway. Sometimes you need a break, you need a pause. You need your brain to stop functioning in the way that it's been functioning to give you some relief. But if you don't turn the steering wheel of your truck and drive it down a different grassy pathway, you're never going to change the function of what's going on. And if you just do it a few times, if you just, oh, I'm going to do 3 yoga classes, or I'll meditate a couple of times, or I'll go on a 30-day diet or exercise program, you're just kind of flattening the grass in your brain, right? You really have to get after it and make it consistent and a part of your lifestyle. And for that, you need pragmatic tools, you need support, you need accountability, you need community, you need all those other sorts of things.
Yes.
And sometimes you need pills and procedures to put the gate up over that other pathway so that you can do something different.
Yep. I love it so much. You're making me think about the disease model of addiction, or I should say, you're making me rethink the disease model of addiction, which exists as, I think, a generally held proposition still to this day. And in that disease model, I think that the person who struggles with addiction, originally it was spoken about as alcoholism when the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous came out in 1939, and came out with a description of the alcoholic, which I'd like to read. And I think this is sort of the seed of the disease model of addiction, which continues today. I'd like to take a look at it, and I'd like to review it with you from today's perspective. I mean, we are 8 decades later. So I'd like to see how this original sort of diagnosis of the alcoholic holds up. In the doctor's opinion of the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous, it says, "We believe, and so suggested a few years ago, that the action of alcohol on these chronic alcoholics is a manifestation of an allergy. That the phenomenon of craving is limited to this class and never occurs in the average temperate drinker. These allergic types can never safely use alcohol in any form at all. And once having formed the habit and found they cannot break it, once having lost their self-confidence, their reliance upon things human, their problems pile up on them and become astonishingly difficult to solve." So that concept of there's a class of people who are in their constitution different than other people in the way they interact with alcohol, that there's an allergy that's caused in these people that creates the phenomenon of craving. That is the original sort of explanation for the chronic alcoholic. Now, we have to be very specific. That was spoken by a doctor. Those were written down by a doctor back in the late 1930s. They were speaking about chronic alcoholics. It was a different time and a different world, and different things exist now, different pressures and stresses, different drugs and substances, and a whole different world has emerged since then. But what do you think of that concept? That there's this class of people, because all of Alcoholics Anonymous and the future of 12-step recovery was based on that idea that there's something different about me from other people constitutionally. And you could look at genetics, or you could look at something to explain that. But because of that difference, someone like me can never use drugs or alcohol safely because of this difference. To me, based on what you just said, whatever fires together, wires together. And then you spoke about turning the truck and getting out of the groove, and that there might be something you can do. All of a sudden, I'm thinking, wait a minute. Maybe I trained myself into addiction. I went down that country grass road long enough times that my brain started to behave in a certain way that we call addiction today, or at least drug addiction or alcoholism. And that now that I'm sober, modern day medicine would have me believe that I'm in remission from an incurable condition. I would say I trained myself out of addiction the same way I had previously trained myself into addiction. How do you see it?
I love about the doctor's opinion, and what I've really tried to do in my career is not get so bogged down in in the science, so to speak. Now, that's very controversial to say that. It's not that this is not based in science, but what the statement does, I think, is so powerful because it acknowledges that there is, whether it calls it an allergy. So, is alcoholism really an allergy in the traditional sense? Probably not. But what he is speaking to is that there is absolutely a genetic there is a part of it that is uncontrollable, that happens to only certain people, right? Not everybody that takes a drink becomes an alcoholic. Not everybody that walks into a bar every day for 20 years is going to become an alcoholic. There are certainly some components of this that are um, nature, right, as opposed to nurture.
Hmm.
And so you can call that an allergy. You can call that predisposition to, genetic predisposition or whatever it is. And the thing that I love about what we know about neuroscience now is that it's incredibly empowering to realize there is a lot that is also nurture. There is a lot that is in our power. It is not something that we should feel shame about, that we did these things, or there are things that we did to put us in this situation. We're not trying to create a sense of fault in that sense. However, if you don't accept and acknowledge all the different things that can contribute and worsen and perpetuate this potential genetic predisposition, then you handcuff yourself in recovery from anything, from chronic illness, because we do have agency over so much of these things. We do have a lot of control in our given our in our outcomes based on how we think and how we behave and the choices that we make. There's no question about that. And so I think it's not anytime we try to get really, me, when I say it's, about science, anytime we try to get really certain and specific about things, that's when I think we do ourselves a disservice. Because if there were a magic bullet for addiction, for diabetes or heart disease, right? Don't you think we would have shot ourselves with it by now, right? We have cut out the disc, we've burned the disc, we've replaced the disc, we've done everything you can do to the disc. There's some people genetically predisposed to disc bulging and disc degeneration, right? But it's not just a matter of the disc. There are so many other things that that go into that. And when I think of it like the wheel of healing. You hold, once you understand this and you realize that it could be relationships, it could be your diet, it could be movement, it could be spirituality, community, creativity, play. Once you realize there are all these different things, that can be overwhelming to people, right? There are a lot of different ways to potentially help treat my addiction. Which one? Where do I go? I'm completely overwhelmed by this. And I think this is the beauty. It's like everything in your life can be a trigger, and everything in your life can be a treatment. And only you have that internal wisdom to know what is the low hanging fruit in your life. What is it that you can grab onto and see some immediate results and then build on that. And the neuroscience would show that when you start to get a foothold and start to see some positive progression with addiction, it tends to build on itself, right? Once your sleep improves, then your mood improves. Once you start to move, then this improves. So just like things can snowball in a really negative, scary direction, they also can snowball just as quickly in the other direction. And in fact, in like veterans who have developed things like PTSD, the people that tend to spiral the most quickly into addiction and pain and all these other things are the ones that also tend to respond the most quickly to these other sorts of treatments because your brain is resilient. It just shows resiliency in your brain, no matter what your genetic predispositions. If you have demonstrated sort of what we call it neuroplasticity, this resiliency in one direction, it can go, or sort of decompensation in one direction. It's actually a marker for how quickly and easily your brain can change. And so it's actually can be a very hopeful thing. It's just people need some guidance and they need some support and they need some accountability to get there. To get there, really.
Yeah. Well, I don't, for me personally, the genetic piece of this is not something that I've looked at in my life. Meaning, well, certainly we all consider our family, and I can look around me and I can see a host of challenges and emotional and physical and all kinds of challenges. As I think anybody who looks at their family these days and their history might find some of those things. But to me, I like to really, really focus on the epigenetic, on the more the nurture and the lifestyle and behaviors, and also the concept of sort of changing one's opinion about priority and what's important in your life. I think in the old days, it was unthinkable to go through time and space without drinking. That unless you were a religious person, like a deeply religious person where it was against your religion and you were trained not to drink, most of us grew up in a society where you were trained to drink, where the opinion was, this is how we get through life. This is how we move through. This is how we celebrate. This is how we deal with excitement. This is how we deal with grief. Like there's always going to be a substance there to help us move through whatever the thing is that we're facing. And I think we've been trained that way. I'm thinking that part of recovery, so you have sobriety, which is abstinence from, but then you have recovery, which is more of an awakening, an ongoing process through your life. And I think through recovery, at least for me personally, I've woken up to the reality that I'm so thankful that I have the intelligence not to poison myself on a regular basis, as I see everybody else doing. Some people would say, well, don't take away my alcohol. What's wrong with me drinking a few drinks a day? Well, there's nothing wrong with it unless there's something wrong with it for you. For me, there was something wrong with that. And so I'm not trying to drink responsibly. I'm not trying to drink effectively. I'm not trying, my great boast in the world is not, I managed my alcohol well. Like there's an awakening beyond all that to say, hey, that's not the only way to go through time and space. And so the disease of alcoholism, which I was a diseased person at one point in time with the way I approached alcohol and drugs, but I'm not that any longer. And so somehow, and I see a lot of people in Recovery 2.0, especially with the deep practices of yoga, meditation, breath work, et cetera, who are healing themselves to such an extent that that disease model doesn't hold up for us any longer.
Yeah, I often tell my patients with opioid addiction, I'm in pain, so I work a lot with patients with opioid addiction that, I conceptualize it very much like diabetes, that there are some people that can eat cupcakes their entire life and will never develop a problem with their blood sugar. And there are some people that need insulin shots from the time they're 10 years old. Those are probably have significant genetic components to them. It doesn't mean that they cannot be modified by lifestyle to some way, but there are significant genetic components. And there are some people that can take huge doses of opioids for chronic pain their entire life and never develop the first craving to take anything extra. And there are some people, the first time they are exposed to opioids, they cannot conceive of not taking more and more.
I want to push back on that statement. The first part of that statement.
Yeah.
That there are people who can take large amounts of opioids day in and day out and not develop craving.
Yeah, there are some that I've seen. Yeah.
Huh.
Mm-hmm.
I've never heard or seen that. But of course, look at the world I walk in.
Right. Yeah.
you know?
So there, I mean, yeah, and I've been seeing patients for a long, they really can. There are some, and those are anomalies. My point is they're anomalies.
Huh.
It's not that they don't exist, they're anomalies. Most people, if they eat cupcakes every day of their life, eventually they will develop some um, problems with that. Most people, if they take big doses of opioids for any period of time, they will develop problems with that. And it creeps up on a spectrum for most people. So you see this in addiction all the time. There are some people that, oh, I can smoke weed and it was great, for the first 2, 3 years I did it. And then things start to change in your brain chemistry. What wires together fires together. This is when all your behavioral things start to really dovetail and solidify those pathways,
Hmm.
right? And it's the same with any sort of addiction. So the point that you're pushing back on is what I was saying is both of those are extreme, right? There are very
I
few
see.
people that have diabetes that requires injection at 10. And there are very few people that can eat cupcakes their entire life and never develop diabetes, right? But most of us are in the middle where the nurture is the most critical part because you are everything that you do, everything in your upbringing, everything, all the choices that you make start to build and build and build. And that is the difference between mild substance use disorder and then eventually a severe substance use disorder. So I think of it more like a spectrum.
Hmm. I wouldn't want to be on that spectrum anywhere.
Right.
I mean, that's me,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
my point is I see a lot of people in society, who are able to get by, but they need their alcohol as a medicine, or they need their cannabis as a medicine, sort of a social lubricant, or it's taking away some of their pain. It's the way that, or emotionally, they're dealing with something that's hard for them to deal with without those substances. That doesn't make them bad people. That doesn't make them weak people, even. It's just a decision on how you want to get through time and space. And then one has to sort of look at the consequences of deciding to go down that road. One of the consequences for some people is severe drug addiction, like me. But another consequence is just never realizing the fullest bloom of your life, never benefiting from understanding and dealing with emotions and moving through them, but pushing them aside in the difficulty and the challenge of dealing with them, which I have tremendous compassion for, but I don't recommend it as a way to approach life. So I guess I'm inviting anyone anywhere into the experiment of being clean and sober, free from drugs and alcohol for a period of time in your life, to have an experience of what that's like, and then to make a decision of what relationship you'd like to have with those substances in your life, if any. But
Exactly. Yeah. And that goes exactly back to what I was saying that even in the healthcare system, it's sort of cruel and unusual to take away people's coping strategy if you don't offer them a different solution. So, this is what Recovery 2.0 does. It's like, I understand that you're doing these things to cope. And most people, I share your opinion that most people, if you looked at the criteria for what defines a substance use disorder, and you really only need a couple of them in order to classify officially as having like a mild substance use disorder. And it can be things just like taking a substance in bigger quantities for longer than you expected, or um, changing your social life, or differences in your relationships because of these substances. Almost everybody has that for something in their life, like we've talked about
yes.
for food or alcohol. And so there's always the opportunity. But when people don't know any different, they don't know that they're on that spectrum. They don't know that they're moving along that pathway. They think if they're not under under the bridge shooting up heroin, then they're okay. There are
Mm.
lots of very highly functioning people that are suffering, but they
Yeah.
don't know there's a different way. Because if you just take away those substances and there's not a program, there's not a community, there's not a source of stability and like spirituality as, in connection,
But
it's
this is
hard.
it.
It's
No.
hard to stay away from it.
Well, this is interesting because in the doctor's opinion that I just read, they're speaking about the chronic alcoholic, and they're trying to explain, here's what we think a chronic alcoholic is. I think we've expanded our desire to support people into recovery who aren't chronic alcoholics, but who are struggling. In Recovery 2.0, it really isn't so much about am I an alcoholic or not? The better question is am I living the life I want to live? Do I have the relationships I want to have? How's my body feeling? How am I in my mind? Am I able to successfully spend time with myself and feel comfortable? Like, these are the questions that are more important questions now, I think, more relevant than, gosh, I wonder if I fit the criteria for chronic alcoholism or not. Because
Absolutely.
yeah, but guess what? Like, people look at that, they go to that, and maybe they don't fit the criteria. I'm not a chronic alcoholic. And they're like, oh, thank God I don't have to stop drinking.
Right.
So it's like you have been given permission by an 85-year-old document and statement to continue living in a self-destructive way, even though it's not destructive to the extent that they were speaking about in 1939 when that book came out. So it's really interesting that we have this new category of person who may or may not fit chronic alcoholism or addiction, but who could use a little help with their relationships
Absolutely.
and everything in their life, you know?
Yeah. And I mean, I was one of those people, right? I never met the criteria of a chronic alcoholic that had difficulty doing my job or, had stated problems with my relationship. But I just knew that I was burned out. I was using alcohol as a coping skill, and this was not serving me. Right. And yet, if I look, I was like, well, I'm not going down that pathway and naming myself this and doing all this kind of stuff. And so something like Recovery 2.0 that has a very broad and loving acceptance of wherever you come in without having to label yourself in certain stigmatizing ways. You just want to live a healthier, more connected life. This is what Recovery 2.0 helps you do. And you don't have to label yourself in a certain way. You provide education for people, which I think is really empowering and important. There's also different tools. There's community, there's a structure and a program, and really freedom for people to explore that wheel of healing, as I was mentioning earlier. Where in your life can we start? Where can we start? You pick, right? You don't have to define yourself this or that. Is it relationships? Is it a substance? You pick. Where do you feel? Because the treatment is the same. The treatment, the program is essentially the same. It's figuring out where are you disconnected and help us show you how you can cultivate that sort of healing in yourself, on your path, on your specific path of recovery and discovery. What a beautiful thing.
Yes, what a beautiful thing. Thank you, Tracy, for those kind words. I want to let people know here what you ended up doing. So you went on a little journey with some of your patients who were in the worst situation, as you described it. I'm going to read this here from your letter. In 2017, I invited 12 of my most suffering patients to come to Gray Bear Lodge in Tennessee, nestled on 400 acres of forest, no Wi-Fi, limited cell signal, rustic accommodations. We spent 2 weeks together. And you really went into nature, breath work, therapy, yoga, connection, eating together, being together. And you even had their families come out. And you, as the facilitators, you also participated in all this with them. This was the findings. An independent researcher analyzed data from our retreat, collected before, immediately after, and 4 weeks, and then 6 months later. It confirmed what I set out to prove to myself, and what I knew was resoundingly true even while I was there. This retreat worked better than anything I had ever done for any patient in my academic medical career. Wow. And it wasn't just measured in pain scores or days of relief. It was an empowering metamorphosis, a transformation for all of us. This is what you wrote. I quit my job at Vanderbilt 2 weeks later. I could never again imply to anyone that an epidural steroid injection was going to help their 20 years of suffering. Once you have seen, you can never unsee, and I have never looked back. I mean, that's mind-blowing. And so
It really is true.
Well, I mean, here we are now. What are you going to do now that you've seen and you can't unsee? Hopefully you're going to work with Recovery 2.0 and help us to grow because that finding is so important.
It really is. And I mean, this is why we've reconnected. And I continue to just recognize that I am not as much a doctor as in this point as a coach. And instead of telling people what to do, this is what you need to do to treat your pain, I feel like people have a lot of intuitive wisdom within them about what is going on with them. They've been living with themselves 24/7, 365 their whole life. I mean, there's no other person that will know intimately all the things that they have been through other than them. And so what I really am interested in is putting people in communities where they are set up to succeed, because people are going to enter recovery at different places in vulnerability. And you want to be able to have a safe container, a circle, as you call it, where they can feel safe, where they can see other people who are recovering or have recovered on the other side. And that if they need to learn more, if they need some education, that's there. If they need to connect with another person, that's there. And for everybody, movement, it really doesn't matter what it looks like, but as long as you have some movement, some mindfulness, some spiritual connection, whether you consider that God or nature, or just realizing that, that it's not you, right? You are not the one in control, that there's some acceptance and surrender to what's going on, some awareness of what we are putting into our body, both the words, the food, the relationships, how all of that matters. And then allowing people to trigger themselves and soothe themselves, and trigger themselves and soothe themselves in a very safe container. And I think that is what you offer. And you use the language of yoga as the big overarching umbrella of that. And that language very much mirrors what I have found in these programs that I have done. It is breath work. It is movement. It is community. It is connection. It is all of those things. And everybody's going to dabble in a little of all of that in their way. So it's not as restrictive. It doesn't feel like you have to do this in this particular order to get better. It just basically says you are welcome to be here. We encourage you to be here as often, as frequently as you can. And when you do that, the more you do that, you will see that you will get better. And then people feel it in their bodies. And that's why people change. Once they've had that experience, they believe. And, this program offers them that experience. They are making their own grassy pathway, right, in their brain. It's really a beautiful thing. It's really a beautiful thing to have accountability and community and freedom to explore healing in a non-judgmental way.
Wonderful. I'm smiling at the grassy pathway in your brain. I just love it so much. It's such a great analogy. So November. You spent 7 days on retreat. Um, tell me, give me one takeaway for you personally, just in your experience, both on the mat, doing physical practice, but also the pranayama or breath work, also the meditation and community. Like one takeaway, one thing for you that was helpful that you could share.
I think the most important initial thing for anyone in recovery is to be willing, is to decide that they are going to be willing to try things out of their comfort zone and be curious about what could happen. And anything you do, if you go into, especially a retreat type setting, like you offered in that week, willing to trust that there is so much more than our prior limiting beliefs and experiences and behaviors out there. And you don't have to know what it is. You don't have to necessarily believe it right from the start. But if you show up willing to try something different, especially when it makes common sense, when you can understand it, then that is where the magic really begins. That is where the path to recovery really takes root, is people's willingness to try something different.
Cool.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, thank you for coming.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
It was a joy having you there, Mike. All right, Tracy. So I feel like we only scratched the surface, but if there's any final parting words you have for people out there who might be really up against it, we're in the new year, and any words of wisdom, words of support, motivation, from your perspective as someone who's been, trained medically, scientifically, and also someone who's had obviously a deep, deep look at this life and embraces the fullness of your being. What can you offer to somebody who really isn't there yet and who's really struggling in their mind, perhaps in their body too?
I think I keep just always going back to remembering you are not broken. You are resilient. And the fact that you are even willing to listen to something like this, to try something new, is the biggest prognostic indicator that you will get better. It takes time. It doesn't happen overnight, but willingness and consistency is key. And you really, again, you are not broken. You are resilient. Happy New Year.
Thank you so much, Tracy. So I don't know if you know, but this is our 100th episode of In the Circle. And so we're celebrating that with this discussion, and it couldn't have gone better. I'm so delighted. So thank you for joining us and for taking your spot, Tracy, in the circle, as you have. I want to thank everybody for being here today. We got into a lot of really, really important things as we look at past, present, and future. We look at the continuum of our learning on our own paths of discovery, as doctors, as scientists of life, as people who are interested in being healthy and whole and well and connected and loving and loved, and all the things that make this life wonderful. Happy New Year to everybody. And if you're listening to this and it's not January and it's not the new year, happy new day to you. And may this be like a new year and a new start, if that's what's needed here. So blessings to all, peace to all, love to all, Sat Nam to everybody. And signing off, Tommy and Dr. Tracy Jackson here on In the Circle. Much love to all.